It started with heat. Not the kind that comes from passion, not yet, but the kind that seeps through your skin in the middle of July when the air is too still and your body starts remembering things you told it to forget. My husband was away on business again. The house, once filled with the noise of children and casual affection, had fallen into a silence so thick I could almost hear it breathing. And then the air conditioner broke. Just like that, the last illusion of comfort melted away. The sweat on my back was no longer shy. My tank top clung to me like a secret. My skin begging for something. Anything to stir the dead heat. That's when I called him Nick, my neighbor just across the street. Strong hands, quiet voice, a presence that felt like shade in the middle of a scorched afternoon. I told myself it was practical. I told myself it was innocent. But the truth, I think I'd already opened a door long before he ever stepped into my home. And once that door opened, the heat wasn't just in the air anymore. It was in me. They say silence is golden, but they never tell you that it can also weigh you down like wet wool on a winter's back. The kind of silence that stretches across empty hallways, lingering in corners, where laughter once echoed, where footsteps used to interrupt the stillness. My name is Lena. I'm 33, and I live in a quiet suburb just outside of Portland, Oregon. My house is modest, our neighborhood pleasant. In the way brochures try to promise a row of identical dreams, painted beige and pastel. My husband Michael works in software. He's away again, third time this month. Denver, this time, or maybe Austin. I forget. He always leaves early in the morning, like he's sneaking out of a dream. He no longer wants to remember. The kids are at my parents' place for the summer, a decision we both agreed on, give them a change of scenery. Give me some quiet. I thought I'd enjoy it. I thought I'd stretch out on the couch, binge my guilty pleasure shows, eat cereal for dinner. But I hadn't prepared for this kind of quiet. The oppressive kind. The kind that hums under your skin and makes the walls feel too close. And then the heat came. Oregon is known for rain, but no one tells you about the kind of heat that sits on your skin, like regret thick, slow, and inescapable. Our air conditioner sputtered, whined, and finally gave up on a Thursday afternoon, just as the temperature outside crossed 90. I opened every window. Nothing. The air was still heavy, like the house was holding its breath. I laid on the floor in my tank top and shorts, hoping the cold tiles would help, but even they had surrendered. Sweat slid down my back like uninvited fingers. Every minute passed like a slow boil. That's when I remembered Nick. He moved in 6 months ago, 2 houses down, diagonally across the street. We'd spoken in passing, neighborly waves. A shared joke about the HOA, a borrowed toolbox once. He had kind eyes and rough hands. The kind of man who probably fixed things for the satisfaction of seeing something broken. Become whole again. I didn't want to call Michael. He'd only worry and then brush it off with a promise to get someone next week. I needed relief now, and somehow calling Nick didn't feel like crossing a line. It felt practical. I hesitated before knocking on his door. Part of me felt silly, like a schoolgirl with a pretext. But I rang the bell anyway, and when he opened the door, shirtless, wiping his hands on a rag, I almost forgot how to speak. "Hey Nick, sorry to bother you. My AC just died. I remembered you mentioned you work with HVAC. He blinked at me, then smiled slow and easy. "Yeah, you want me to take a look?" His voice was calm, low, like the first breeze before a storm. I nodded. We walked back to my house, and I noticed how his presence filled the silence in a different way than Michael's ever did. Not louder, not stronger, just warmer, like the air shifted to make room for him. He crouched down beside the machine, started fiddling with wires and circuits. I sat on the couch legs curled under me, pretending to scroll through my phone, but watching him instead. There was something about the way he moved, intentional, focused muscles, flexing under sun-darkened skin. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just doing what he knew, what he'd probably done 100 times before. And yet watching him, I felt something stir inside me. Not lust, not exactly. Something deeper. Something I hadn't named in years. Maybe it was the heat. Maybe it was the silence. Or maybe it was me, no longer sure if I was still being the woman I'd always promised myself I'd be. When he stood up and looked at me wiping the sweat from his brow, I didn't ask him how much it would cost. I asked him if he wanted a glass of cold water. He said yes. And as he stepped into the kitchen, the air didn't feel quite so still anymore. Not because the AC was fixed, but because something else had started to hum. Inside me, Nick took the glass of water with a soft thanks and drank it in slow, steady sips. I watched the way his throat moved, the sweat on his temple catching the kitchen light. There was nothing seductive about it, and yet it felt like I was witnessing something I shouldn't be allowed to see. Something bare. Undressed of intention, but not of consequence. He placed the glass on the counter and gave me a nod. It should work now. The capacitor was fried. I replaced it with a spare I had in my truck. Might want to get a full tune-up before fall. I smiled a little too long. You're a lifesaver, he shrugged, almost embarrassed. Just doing what I do. And then there was that silence again. But it wasn't heavy now. It was charged. A kind of pause that waits to be broken. Only if someone is brave enough. Neither of us was. He nodded toward the door. All right, I'll head out. Wait, do you want to stay for a bit? Cool off, I heard myself asking. It sounded casual, harmless, but the weight of it hit the floor like a dropped wine glass. Nick blinked. His hesitation was brief, almost imperceptible. Then he gave me a small smile and leaned against the wall. Instead of leaving, I made us iced tea. I think I needed to keep my hands busy. The clinking of ice cubes was louder than the thoughts in my head. But only just. I handed him a glass, and our fingers brushed. Not a spark, not a jolt. Something quieter. A recognition. We talked about nothing, really. Whether neighbors his job. My kids. I told him Michael was in Denver. Or Austin. I still couldn't remember, and that felt worse somehow. Nick listened more than he spoke. His eyes never wandered, never lingered where they shouldn't. And yet the way he looked at me made me feel more seen than I had in months. Maybe years. Michael loved me, I never doubted that. But somewhere along the line, that love became a routine. A gentle, dependable rhythm. He kissed my cheek instead of my mouth. He made coffee every morning, but never asked how I slept. Our conversations had become bullet points, schedules, bills, groceries, school runs. Nick wasn't trying to replace that. He couldn't. He didn't know me like Michael did. But that afternoon, he saw something. Michael hadn't noticed in a long time. The woman I still was beneath the layers of responsibility, compromise, and quiet resignation. When Nick finally left the air conditioner humming in the background, I stood in the hallway for a long time. The floor felt cooler now, the house less suffocating, but inside me, something had begun to flicker. A question I didn't want to ask. Why did I feel more alive after talking to a near stranger than I had in my husband's arms in months? That night, I lay awake in bed, the sheets sticking to my skin. The ceiling fan spun above me like an old clock, slow and disinterested. I thought about Nick's hands. Not what they had done, but what they could. I remembered how they held tools, how they wiped sweat away, how they held a glass, steady, grounded. Like they'd never tremble, even if the world did. Michael's hands were different. Softer, precise, always typing, clicking, scrolling. They smelled like soap and caffeine. They held mine during dinners at church at airports, but they didn't wander anymore, not like they used to. I turned on my side, pulled the pillow close, and felt the ache of a woman who had tasted something she hadn't known she'd been hungry for. Not lust, not infidelity. It was something gentler, but far more dangerous attention. Real, undivided, masculine attention. The next morning, I saw Nick in his front yard loading tools into his truck. He looked up and waved. I waved back too fast, like I'd been waiting for it. I shouldn't have. I closed the blinds and leaned against the door. My heart beat faster than it should have, not with guilt, but with the awful thrill of being remembered, of being watched even from afar, of being once again a possibility. Later that day, I tried to distract myself. Laundry emails, cleaning the junk drawer I even called Michael. His voice was kind but distant, like he was already in tomorrow. He asked how the kids forgot they weren't home. That night, I dreamed of a room with no doors, just windows. And outside the window, Nick was working in the heat. And I was inside, wanting to open it. Wanting to let something in. Not him necessarily, but something he carried with him. When I woke up, I was sweating again. Not from the temperature, but from the pressure of everything. I hadn't said everything I hadn't dared feel. I didn't know what was happening yet. Only that it had begun. And that scared me more than I wanted to admit. The morning air was cool for once. A breeze rolled in from somewhere far off, somewhere kinder. I sat on the porch with a mug of coffee going cold in my hands, watching the steam curl upward like a ghost trying to remember who it once was. I don't know when I began comparing them. Michael and Nick. Perhaps it was that night in the stillness after the air conditioner came back to life, when my thoughts reached for comfort and found instead the flicker of something unfamiliar. Or maybe it started long before that in the quiet erosion of my marriage. In the 1,000 moments Michael and I stopped choosing each other, even while pretending we still did. Michael is a good man. I know that sounds like a justification, but it's simply true. He is thoughtful, calm, intelligent. He never raises his voice. He remembers birthdays. He never forgets to call when his flight lands. But his touch had become something that belonged to obligation. A polite gesture, a routine affection, like washing your hands before dinner. Not because you feel dirty, but because that's just what you do. The last time he kissed me with hunger, I think the leaves were still green. The kids were younger. We were still waking up tangled in each other's legs on weekends. He used to trace my collarbone with his lips. He used to call me trouble with a grin that hinted at stories only we knew. Now, when he says my name, it sounds like a password. We don't fight. We don't hurt each other. We don't even ignore each other. We've just faded. I told myself that was normal. That marriage's mellow love matures priorities shift. I wore that belief like a cardigan, something soft enough to keep me warm. Even if it never quite fit. Right? And then came Nick. It's not that he said anything. Michael wouldn't. It was how he looked at me when I wasn't speaking. Like he was listening to a part of me I'd forgotten how to express. Like he could see the tension in my shoulders before I even noticed it. He didn't offer solutions. He didn't tell me I was overthinking. He just made space. One afternoon, I passed by the mirror in the hallway and caught my reflection in a way that felt unfamiliar. There was a flush in my cheeks, a spark in my eyes that didn't belong to housework or meal planning or errands. I stared at myself like a woman who had just stumbled into the light after a long time underground. What was I seeing? Desire? No, not yet. It was awareness, the beginning of an awakening, painful in its clarity. I began to notice things about Nick that I hadn't before, the way he squinted into the sun, the way his hands were always slightly rough but careful, the way he didn't interrupt, the way he leaned in when he laughed. And every time I noticed those things, I felt a tug in my chest. A pull between two truths. I loved my husband, and I was beginning to feel something dangerous for another man. The contradiction lived inside me like a secret room in a familiar house. Always there, just hidden behind a door I didn't want to open. One night I dreamed of Michael, not the man I wake up beside, but the version of him I married. His hair longer, eyes brighter smile, crooked with mischief. We were lying in a field. He was telling me about a dream. He had something absurd and romantic. And I was laughing, really laughing, in a way that shook my ribs. When I woke, the bed was empty beside me. Michael had left early again for another meeting. I reached for the pillow where his head had been. Still warm, but only just. I spent the rest of that day trying not to think about Nick, and failing. He hadn't come by again. He hadn't texted, hadn't called. And I hadn't expected him to. What would I say? Thank you for fixing the AC. Thank you for reminding me what it feels like to be visible. But the space he left was undeniable, like walking into a room you thought was full and finding it empty instead. That evening, I found myself in the garage digging through a box of old things. I told myself I was looking for something practical, a screwdriver maybe, or the kids' sidewalk chalk. But really, I think I was looking for a distraction. Something that would ground me, something that didn't feel like longing. I found instead an old photograph Michael and I on our honeymoon. We were on a boat, his arms wrapped around my waist. Both of us sunburnt and laughing. I remember that moment clearly. I remember the way he looked at me, not just with love, but with a kind of awe, like he couldn't believe I'd chosen him. When did he stop looking at me that way? When did I stop looking at him like he was the center of my world? And how did Nick, a man I barely knew, suddenly slip into the space Michael used to fill? I pressed the photo to my chest and sat on the floor. And for the first time in a long time, I cried. Not because I felt guilty, but because I missed something. I wasn't sure I'd ever have again. That night when Michael called, I didn't mention the photo. I didn't mention the tears. I asked about his day. He told me he was tired. We said I love you like punctuation. Familiar automatic final. But after I hung up, I lay in bed and whispered into the dark. Do you still see me, Michael? There was no answer. Only the soft rhythmic hum of the air conditioner and the silence it filled too perfectly. The day passed quietly, the kind of quiet that doesn't calm but unsettles. I moved through the house like a shadow chasing itself, folding laundry. I didn't care about scrubbing counters that were already clean. My body was in motion, but my thoughts drifted elsewhere, circling like birds above something I hadn't yet named. The air was thick again by late afternoon. The kind of heat that doesn't just sit on your skin, but crawls inside you stubborn and slow. I stood in front of the open fridge for longer than I needed, letting the cold spill over my bare arms like a whispered apology. And then the lights flickered once then again. And then they died. All of them. I stood in the kitchen, blinking into the sudden hush of electricity gone still. No hum from the fridge. No lights humming overhead. No AC groaning its steady lull. The power was out. Outside dusk was beginning to pool in the corners of the sky. I stepped onto the back porch, barefoot, letting the cool concrete draw some of the heat from my feet. The air outside was barely better, but at least it moved. I let my head tilt back neck, exposed to the fading sun eyes closed. And then I heard it, a soft shuffle, the sound of someone else breathing in the silence. Power's out here too, a voice called, familiar steady. I opened my eyes. Nick was standing in his yard, just across the fence, a cigarette between his fingers, smoke curling like ink into the amber sky. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely carrying. "Looks like we're stuck in the dark." He smiled, not with amusement, but with understanding. As if he'd already accepted the night for what it was going to be. He took a drag, then gestured. "Want some company? I've got matches. Candles too. Might make it feel less like the end of the world." I nodded before I thought about it. We sat on my porch, two figures in the twilight, the candle between us flickering against the dark like a single heartbeat trying to keep pace. Nick didn't press. He didn't touch me. He didn't even look at me the way I feared he might. And maybe that's what undid me, the fact that he didn't assume anything. That he just sat there quiet, letting the air and the silence and the shared warmth of presence speak in ways neither of us dared. At some point, I began to talk. Not about the power or the heat or the neighborhood. About Michael. Not his job, not his travels. But about the way he used to hold me in the middle of a sentence just because he couldn't wait. About how he used to pull me close after arguments pressing his forehead to mine, as if proximity could undo pain. I spoke of the way he had slowly stopped doing those things, not out of cruelty, but because life crept in, like mold in the corners, quiet, unnoticed, and relentless. Nick listened, that's all. And then when I could no longer stand the sound of my own confessions, I said the thing I'd buried for weeks. I don't think he sees me anymore. It came out so quietly, I wasn't even sure I'd said it aloud. But Nick turned toward me then, and the look in his eyes wasn't pity. It wasn't hunger. It was recognition. "You're not invisible, Lena," he said. "I see you, and I think maybe you've been aching for someone to say that out loud." I should have cried or laughed or told him to go, but instead I just sat there, throat tight, heart thudding in my chest like a warning bell muffled by years of compromise. And then, like gravity knew something we didn't, I found myself leaning toward him. Not much. Not enough to blame the moment on momentum or accident, but enough. He met me halfway. The kiss wasn't urgent, it wasn't even passionate, it was quiet, intentional. The way one might press a hand to a wound, not to heal it, but to say, "I know it hurts." His lips were dry and warm, and when he pulled back, he didn't say anything. He just searched my eyes like someone trying to memorize a map. He knows he'll never see again. I could have stopped there, I should have. But the silence between us had already changed shape. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of something heavy and human. I took his hand, led him inside. My breath shook as I turned the handle to the bedroom door, a part of me screaming at the threshold. This is where the line is. Lena, but there were no more lines. Only this moment, only now. What happened next was not wild, not frantic. It was something else, something slower, more deliberate. As if we were both unwrapping years of quiet ache, one layer at a time. He touched me like I was real, like I was not a mother, not a wife, not someone else's. Just a woman, a body, a breath. Michael had never touched me like that. Even in our best days, our love had structure rhythm, a script. But with Nick, there was no script. Just two people reaching for each other in the dark, hoping the other might understand without needing to explain. I don't know how long we lay there afterward. I don't know what time the lights came back on. But I remember the way he curled behind me, one arm, draped gently across my waist, not claiming, just being there. And I remember thinking, this moment isn't love, but it is something dangerously close. Morning didn't come with light. It came with weight. A thick, breathless kind of stillness that wrapped itself around my skin like damp linen. I didn't want to open my eyes. Didn't want to see what the sun might reveal about the night I had tried to make invisible. But eventually I did. Because that's what morning requires of us to wake. To see Nick was lying next to me, his chest bare, one hand resting just barely on the sheet between us. He wasn't asleep. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling like it might offer answers to a question he hadn't dared speak aloud. Neither of us said anything. The silence between us had changed again. It was no longer charged or inviting. It was something else now. Something colder. Heavily gentle. A silence that understood too much to ask for anything more. I pulled the sheet around me and sat up slowly, the air brushing my skin like a reminder of what couldn't be undone. My body still felt him, not in a carnal way, but in a way that made me feel porous, like something had entered through the smallest cracks and made a home where certainty used to live. Nick sat up too, rubbing his face, like a man who'd walked a longer road than he planned for. He looked at me with a softness I didn't expect. And for a second, I wondered if he'd say anything to make it less complicated. But he didn't. You okay? He asked. Finally, I nodded, though I wasn't sure what that meant. Okay, no. Not really, but also not shattered, not torn, just hollowed. I should go, he said quietly. I didn't ask him to stay, and maybe that was the clearest sign that I knew it had already gone too far. He dressed without looking at me. Not out of shame. I think we'd both moved past shame, but out of respect. As though the act of not watching me gather my own pieces was the last kindness he could offer. At the door he turned. I don't regret it, Lena. But I know what it means. I met his eyes. What does it mean? He took a breath. It means we can't pretend it didn't happen. And we also can't pretend it can happen again. I nodded again. My voice was a stranger now, hiding behind the pounding in my chest. Thank you. He didn't ask what for. He just nodded once and left the door closing behind him, with a softness that broke something anyway. I stood there for a long time, long enough for the sun to stretch across the hardwood floor, long enough to hear the world outside start moving again, birds, cars, footsteps. But inside, everything stayed still. When I finally stepped into the bathroom, I saw myself in the mirror and stopped. Not because I looked different, but because I didn't. I had expected something, A mark A shift, some signal that I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But there I was, same face, same tired eyes, same body wrapped in the same robe. But something beneath the surface had changed. A quiet fracture not visible to the world, but spreading. I didn't cry, I didn't curse, I didn't spiral. Instead, I made coffee, because there is something eerily mechanical about guilt when it settles quietly. It doesn't rage, it doesn't scream. It simply lives in the small decisions, in the way your hands tremble when you reach for a mug, the way you avoid your own reflection in the kettle's curve. Later that morning, Michael called. I hesitated before answering, as if the phone might burn my hand. When I picked up, his voice came through as it always did. Warm, efficient, focused. Hey, just checking in. Flight was delayed last night. I'll be home by noon. I swallowed hard. Okay, do you want me to pick you up? No, I'll grab a ride, just rest. You sound tired, I laughed softly. Not because it was funny, but because the irony was thick enough to taste. Yeah, didn't sleep well. He paused. Something wrong? No, just power outage last night. House was hot. He made a sympathetic sound. Damn, I'll call the utility company later. See if they've got a rebate program or something. Did the AC come back? Eventually, I said. But it wasn't the air that had cooled. It was everything else. After the call, I cleaned, not obsessively. Not out of guilt, but because I needed something to do. Something to organize, something to make sense of when I couldn't make sense of myself. I washed the sheets. Not because they smelled like him, but because they smelled like me. And I didn't know what that meant anymore. When Michael walked through the door a few hours later, he looked tired, but happy to see me. He kissed my cheek, wrapped his arms around me, and told me he missed me. I said I missed you too. And it wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. He didn't notice anything. Or if he did, he didn't say. That night we lay in bed together, his arm around me. The rhythm of his breathing slow and even, familiar safe. I stared at the ceiling. The fan spun above us, humming a steady lull. And I wondered if he could feel it, the space between us that hadn't been there before. Not a wall, not a chasm, just a shift in gravity. Small, silent, irreversible. I thought of Nick. Not his touch. Not the act, but the way he said my name, like it belonged to me first. For the next few days, life returned to its rhythm. Or at least it tried to. Michael was home. The children returned from their stay with my parents, filling the house with a noise that masked the stillness inside me. There were lunches to make toys, to pick up laundry, to fold schedules to reestablish. And yet, I moved through it all like someone watching herself from across the room. Everything felt slightly delayed, like sound trailing behind the picture. I kept waiting for something to feel different. For Michael to pause and look at me longer than usual. For him to tilt his head and say, "Is there something you want to tell me?" But he didn't. He smiled the same, touched me the same, said "I love you" with the same cadence, the same familiar ease. If he sensed something, he buried it beneath the weight of routine. And I let him. Because what would I have said? There are no words soft enough to explain a betrayal born from loneliness. There's no kind way to say, "You didn't do anything wrong." But I broke anyway, so I carried it quietly like a glass shard in my pocket. Small, sharp, and always there. Nick didn't come by again. I saw him once through the slats of the blinds. He was working on his car in the driveway, shirtless under the sun. Just like the first time I really noticed him. But this time I didn't wave, and he didn't look up. It wasn't anger, it wasn't avoidance. It was something simpler. Finality. We had shared something impossible, and now it lived only in the spaces between memory and regret. The silence between us wasn't cold. It was reverent. Like two people who had stumbled into something sacred and then walked backward out of it, careful not to disturb what had been left behind. Still, there were moments when the memory surfaced uninvited. Late at night, folding towels warm from the dryer. Driving alone with the window down, stirring sauce at the stove. The scent of garlic rising like incense. It wasn't the act I remembered. It wasn't even his body. It was the way I had felt momentarily known. Fully present in my skin. Wanted not as a role or a habit, but as a woman, a whole woman. And that feeling, however fleeting, had left a mark. One night, weeks after Michael reached for me in bed. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't urgent. It was gentle, practiced, familiar. His hands touched me like a script he had memorized years ago. I responded the way I always had, with softness, with affection. But somewhere beneath my breath, I was counting seconds. Trying to keep the present from being drowned by the echo of what had come before. When it was over, Michael kissed my shoulder and whispered, "I missed this." And I smiled in the dark. But inside something whispered back, "I miss me." In the morning, he brought me coffee in bed, just like he used to. And that somehow was what broke me. Because Michael hadn't changed. He was still the same man I married, a steady loving. Trying, but I had changed. And I didn't know how to bring myself back. For days after I found myself lingering at mirrors, watching the woman reflected back at me, I studied her face, her lips, the line of her collarbone, as if trying to remember what it felt like to see those features without shame attached to them. I began writing again. Not for anyone. Just in a notebook late at night when the house had finally quieted and my thoughts became too heavy to hold. I wrote about emptiness, about heat, about hands. But mostly I wrote about hunger, not for bodies, but for attention. For the electricity of being seen, of being acknowledged outside of the roles we're taught to wear like armor. Wife, mother, responsible adult. All honorable, all worthy, but all at times exhausting. There was one line I wrote over and over again, without knowing why. Some memories ache like fresh skin under sun. Eventually, the ache dulled. That's what time does. It doesn't erase, it smooths. It sands the edges of what once cut you open and leaves behind something quieter. Something you can touch without bleeding. But even so, I didn't forget. And that, I think, was the hardest part. Because when people speak of infidelity, they speak of damage, of betrayal, of anger. But no one speaks of the longing that still lingers. The longing for the moment that preceded the choice. The second before the kiss. The silence before the fall. The part of you that says, I could walk away. And the part of you that doesn't. It's not a wound you show anyone. It's a private, invisible mark. The kind that changes nothing and everything all at once. Michael was in the kitchen, humming something tuneless while scrambling eggs. The kids were laughing in the living room, fighting over cereal boxes and cartoons. The sun had just begun to settle into the window panes, casting pale yellow across the hardwood floor. It was an ordinary morning. One of those days that passes like breath easy to miss if you're not paying attention. But I was paying attention now more than ever. There's a strange kind of clarity that comes after crossing a line. You once told yourself you never would. Not a brightness, not relief, but stillness. Like the air after a storm, when the trees are still dripping, and no one's sure if it's really over. I moved through the room slowly, as if everything might shatter if I touched it too fast. I kissed Michael's cheek as he stirred the pan. He smiled without looking up. You're up early, I couldn't sleep, I said. He handed me a mug of coffee. Our fingers brushed. He didn't flinch, neither did I. We sat together at the table while the kids ran in and out, their voices like wind chimes, random and sweet. And for a moment, I watched it all like a spectator at my own life. The domesticity, the ease, the routine I had long mistaken for safety. Or maybe I'd known all along that safety and numbness can look very much the same. Michael looked at me then. Really looked. You okay? I nodded, just thinking about what. And here was the pause. The moment where another version of me, braver or crueler, might have told him everything. Laid it bare, asked for forgiveness or consequence or absolution. But I didn't. Not because I was a coward, but because what happened wasn't about hurting him. It was about finding a version of myself I hadn't spoken to in years. And now that I had, I didn't want to bury her again beneath guilt or confession. I wanted to sit with her a while. I wanted to understand her. I'm just tired, I said. He reached across the table and took my hand. His touch was warm, familiar. And I realized with something like sorrow that this was still home. Even if one of the windows had cracked, that night after the dishes were done and the lights were out, I lay awake listening to the rhythm of Michael's breathing. Slow trusting, the sound of someone who believes in permanence. I turned toward him, resting my head lightly against his chest. He stirred half asleep and wrapped his arm around me. I love you, he mumbled into the dark. I know I whispered, and I did. But I also knew that love, while necessary, wasn't always enough. That marriage, even good ones, are made of shadows and light, of choices spoken and unspoken. I knew I would never see Nick again. Not really, we might cross paths. Exchange nods, but the part of him that had seen the part of me no one else had touched in years, that was done, locked behind a door. Neither of us had the key to anymore. And yet, I carried it with me. Not as guilt, not as longing, but as proof. Proof that I was still alive. That underneath the quiet and the roles and the years, I was still a woman, capable of feeling something dangerous and real. And maybe that was what would save me. Not the moment itself, but the truth it revealed. The truth that I had silenced too long. That I wanted more, not from someone else. From myself, the fan above us spun, slow and soft, stirring the air without force. The house breathed with us, quiet, intact, unaware. But I was aware, and I would not forget. Not because I wanted to remember, but because some memories don't ask your permission. They live where they want, and all you can do is learn to live around them. Us